Hello, GrowGainesville. My name is Tavis Douglas. I'm the Associate Professor of Agribusiness at the College of Central Florida in Ocala. And I'm out here at our beautiful Vintage Farm campus where I will be showing you how to prune fruit trees today. So we'll actually be at several locations. We'll be here at this farm in Ocala, as well as my farm up in Citra on the north end of Marion County. We're going to focus on perennial fruiting plants. Specifically how to prune them, anything from small berries such as blueberries and blackberries all the way up to larger trees such as citrus as well as some stone fruits. So I'm excited to get started, and let's go. So the first thing I want to discuss is actually some of the tools that we're going to be using today. Some of my implements of destruction that I typically use are good trusty bypass clippers. This is the Corona brand. They're my favorite brand of clippers, small hand clippers that I use. I grew up using these and use this particular style for about, well, my whole life really, growing up on a tree farm. So these are things I always keep on me for just, basic light kind of pruning. We also have our loppers here that I use for cutting larger material, so cutting branches down low that I can actually reach. They also bypass and slide by the second set of teeth there. These are going to be for cutting things a little bit larger, a 3/4 inch to 1 inch, maybe 1.25 inch wood in diameter. So we're going to use those today as well. Some of our obviously we have our head shears that we use typically for cutting smaller diameter wood, especially when you have a lot of small diameter wood such as hedges. So we use these extensively more or less on blueberries and again low small wood that I can actually reach. I'm going to have to do much more cutting than if I was using my hand clippers, which are going to be a little bit slower than these hedge clippers are going to be. We also have a pruning saw for cutting larger branches. These are going to cut any relatively large diameter type wood. If we have to go in and make any corrective pruning cuts that might be a little too hard to handle with our loppers, we would use this. So we'll demonstrate using this, I think, on some of the trees. And then finally, pole saw, and they come in different styles. This particular one is about 7 feet long. So we have a handle down here that activates the actual bypass clippers at the top. These are really handy to have, obviously, for cutting wood that is out of reach, essentially. So it keeps you from having to get on a ladder. All of this stuff you can pretty much buy locally. These this particular pole saw I actually ordered from Gimpler's, I want to say, Gimpler's Supply, but I've used those for many years. It's not going to cut really large wood, but it's going to do most of what we would need, especially if you're keep on top of pruning on your fruit trees that you're supposed to. And finally, with all of these tools here, you definitely want to make sure they're sharp. So you want to get a nice good file. And if you don't know how to use a file, definitely learn how to use a file to keep all of your tools nice and sharp. If you kind of see the shiny edge of the blade there, just sharpen them. You want to make sure when you do make cuts, you have nice clean cuts, and you don't want to gouge or essentially tear up any of the wood. It's going to be easier on you to have sharp clippers, but also it's going to be better for the plants that you're cutting, that you're not chewing up any of the wood, which can cause pretty massive wounds that fungus and bacteria and other things can get into. Along with the file, not only do you want to keep them sharp, but you want to keep your tools well lubricated as well. Again, the easier they function, the easier it is. It's going to be on you. And if you're anything like me, I use these tools quite extensively on hundreds and hundreds of plants and trees, so I need to make sure that they're in good operating condition. All right, so we'll go ahead and look at some plants. So we're going to start with an avocado tree. See, I've never really pruned trees on camera before, especially by myself operating the camera. But anyway, so this is an avocado tree. It is early February, and as you can see, this avocado is already starting to bloom. So I'm actually not going to prune this particular tree right now. Avocado, because I don't want to cut off the blooms. When you do prune avocados, you want to prune them immediately after harvest. You want to prune out the wood. Essentially, when you prune an avocado, you want to pretty much be able to reach the fruit, right, without being on a ladder. So what you want to do is you would come in, and we're just going to pretend we are, you know, it's after harvest. By the way, avocados in Florida, at least here, well, in north central Florida anyway, produce fruit kind of late July, early August. So you'd want to come in and prune this tree at that point. Because this tree is really tall, it's probably about 10 feet tall. I don't know if you can see from my pole pruner here. So what we would do is come in, we want this fruit to stay lower on the tree so we can more or less reach it from the ground. So we're going to come in and we might remove some of this larger wood. Avocado trees are relatively easy to cut. They have very soft wood, especially these trees here. Avocados don't normally grow in north central Florida, but these have done really well here. Avocados, they actually fruit on first year wood. So if I can pull this out a little bit, so we have our blooms here on the avocado. This soft really green wood here is what the avocado produces on. Now this particular wood will not produce any more flowers or avocados in the future. This is it. What happens is, if I can get back to some older growth here, so this is green wood, and now we're going back into the darker wood down here. What happens is this tree just gets larger and larger, and at the terminal ends of that previous season's growth is where the avocados grow. And eventually, if you don't prune this tree, it'll grow larger and larger and larger, and then the branches get in the way, and then the tree becomes too tall. So this particular, these avocados have actually never been pruned before, so we'll need to go in and make some pruning cuts. Grab my pointer. So what we'll do is I'll come in and maybe cut this guy off around 6 or 7 foot. We're going to have to do what's known as corrective pruning because this tree has never been pruned before. We're going to have to cut it relatively severely to correct some of this larger growth that we have. So we would cut some of these larger branches down. We would also come into the side and to kind of mitigate or limit the width of this plant. So we'll come in and severely cut some of this back right after, again, we're talking early August, right after harvest. Cut it back, fertilize it, water it appropriately, and you should get enough flush between then and before it gets too cold to have a nice crop of avocados the next year. So the general rule of thumb on these avocados and most plants that are in flower, never prune it when the flowers are on it because you're cutting off all of your fruit wood. So there's another avocado tree there that's really tall, or taller than we would like. So we need to come in and do some forced perspective here. We'll have to come in and cut this guy shorter, probably lop the top of it off, go in and make some selective pruning cuts on some branches on the inside and clean it up right after harvest. So that's avocados. All right, moving on to pear trees and really apple trees too, if you grow those in Florida. Some of the growth characteristics of pears as well as apples is that you'll notice that they have very upright growth, very vertical branches. So how these trees are typically trained, if you buy them or even if you grow them yourself, what we're going to do is train the central leader on a central stalk up to about 4 or 5 feet tall, and then we cut the terminal bud off of it and to relieve some of that apical dominance, fancy horticultural word, and force this tree to actually branch. So you want as many branches as you can. You kind of want to, and we'll get this when I discuss some other fruit trees, kind of keep the center somewhat loose and open, because in Florida, humidity can cause a lot of fungal and bacterial issues inside the plant. So you want easy air movement through this tree. Now, pears and apples, when you prune them, and I'm going to walk over here to the tree, and I have no idea if you can see me or not, but essentially we do winter pruning on pears and apples. So what we're going to do on this particular tree, these trees are about 5 or 6 years old now. When they're younger, we try to limit the pruning on them, but as they get larger, to encourage more fruiting wood on these trees, we'll come in and start to prune them. So what we'll do is we'll take off, as a general rule of thumb, no more than 1/3 of the overall canopy of this particular tree. So I'm going to use my my pole saw here, my clippers, and I'm going to cut off all of these terminal branches. Again, I want to limit vertical growth and force the tree to grow further outward and make it easier to pick fruit off of. So hopefully, get these out, get your sticks out. Again, these trees are dormant. We want to make sure that we prune these trees before the buds start to swell. And I'll try to make it as even as I can. It's nothing fancy. But I want to make sure I tackle all of them if I can. Some of the wood's getting a little too big for this, but what I got right now. And then I might come in and cut some of these smaller branches out. Older wood out of the middle to encourage new growth. And probably leave it at that for now. Apple trees will be treated the same way. So once we do our winter pruning, again when the trees are dormant, before the buds swell, we'll prune these trees, which will encourage new growth, spring growth. Hopefully we have a nice crop of pears in late summer. Late summer, I guess, in Florida, when these guys will actually produce. Now we'll look at some grapes. So we have a grape trellis system here. Grapes, we typically prune during the winter months for several reasons. One, it's going to minimize infection. Also, you can actually see the structure of the plant itself. Now, typically, we're growing muscadine grapes in Florida. What we do is we grow a central leader from the base. We might use a cane to train it up to a top trellis bar. So there's a wire that runs horizontally. This is about 4 feet tall, and then we train the plant down the trellis. Now, what we look for in grapes is keep in mind that grapes actually fruit on 1-year-old wood only, so similar in a way to avocados. So what we do is we prune or keep our mature wood along this cable, in this particular case in two directions, and then we've already done the pruning for this particular plant. So all of the fruiting wood that produced fruit last year was cut off, and then this wood here that's now dormant is going to produce grapes for this next summer when they fruit out. If you don't prune grapes, they become an overgrown monster, hard to control, and the larger you let it get, you'll end up with a lot of mature wood that's not going to produce grapes, and very little fruiting wood. So this is about right, what we want. Now, of course, these are going to flush out. They will leaf out. But this is kind of what we want to start with grapes. Going into spring. There's very little else that we need to cut out, but it's a good example of what you actually want to look for. There's about 7 or 8 varieties here of muscadines. There's obviously fancier ways to train grapes and prune them up, you know, pergolas and arbors and things like that. But in a production system such as this, we space the plants out every, I don't know, 15 feet or so, and train them like this. So we're always going to keep this plant in a T shape, so to speak, ground up and then going in both directions, and then pruning back to this vine, this mature vine each year, to limit overgrowth and to encourage new growth that will actually produce grapes the following season. Pomegranates, the ugliest fruit tree in the world, in my opinion. Anyway, so pomegranates can be grown several ways. One single trunk, similar to the grapes that we just looked at, or you know, even like the pear tree, with a single stem coming up from the base before it branches. Most of the time, though, they're going to be maintained as a multi-stem trunk, meaning that we're going to have multiple stems coming up from the base of this tree. Now, again, this is another plant we're going to prune during the dormant months. So right now, basically, we want to limit these, again, plants are about 4 or 5 years old. We'll come in and we're going to prune out. If you notice, the base of this plant has a lot of shoots coming up. We want to limit that to about 4 or 5. So we'll go on the interior of this plant and begin to cut out some of those as well. I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate some of this for you. So we've got, well, let me see if I'm in the camera first. Yeah, more or less. I guess I will be. So we'll come in with our loppers and shears, and we're going to come in and take out some of this inner growth. Any branches that kind of cross, and this goes for most of your fruit trees. You don't want branches that cross or head back towards the middle. You want to force all the growth outward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to open up this center. Again, much like other plants in Florida, you need to do that to encourage air movement. Otherwise, you get a lot of fungal bacteria, infections, and things like that. So any branches that are crossing or growing in, I'm use my loppers to cut some of this interior wood out. And you want to encourage new growth too. So when you do this, you're going to encourage new shoots to grow up. So all the new wood's not all up here. We actually can encourage more growth, newer wood from underneath. So I'm going to go in and cut some of this stuff out. Kind of open it up a little bit. Again, a lot of times it takes multiple tools to accomplish the goal. Come in there. Again, any growth that's inward, we want to force outward, so we're going to leave some of this stuff growing out. Alright, so now that I've opened up the middle of this plant pretty well, I'm going to go ahead and top it. So I'm going to top this plant out basically based on its height that it already is. So these these plants are relatively short, and again, you wouldn't want to cut off more than a third of this particular plant height-wise. So I'm going to go in and just kind of pick a spot, and I can see some of the old pruning marks were down here. So in order to keep this plant smaller, relatively small, I'm going to go in and cut below the old cut marks and force that new growth lower in the tree itself. more or less like that. And again, you could, this is all personal preference, but you can go in and remove as many, more branches, more or less branches, or whatever you like, but just for general use in your yard. Again, like most fruit trees, you want to be able to pick the fruit from the ground. You don't want it way up in the air, it doesn't do you any good. So keeping things, pomegranates are small trees or shrubs in a way. These are kind of maintained like shrubs. So I'm going to prune it down to, this might be, I don't know, 3.5 foot tall. And I just cut out some of the older canes from the center and encourage new growth off the top, and hopefully have a nice crop of pomegranates this year. All right, so this is a plum tree. We're gonna do some severe cuts to this guy here. So plums, peaches, nectarines are all in the same family. They're all in the Prunus family. And they're gonna be pruned in a similar way. We'll look at the peaches in a little bit. But these plum trees have actually not been pruned correctly. Basically what we want on some of these fruit trees is we want essentially a standard clear trunk about 18 to 24 inches tall before it begins to branch. And then we want an open center on this particular plant. So we want to force what's known as scaffold limbs out in all directions. So we have some nice scaffold limbs here. Those two on the outside, this one here, and then this one over here on the right. But this one right in the middle is growing straight up. And this is not what we want. So to do these types of trees, plums as well as peaches and nectarines, we do 2 pruning cycles on them. We'll prune them right after harvest in the summer, and then we'll do another winter pruning on them. We do a winter pruning on them because, as I'm sure you're aware, these trees produce a lot of blooms, way too many blooms, and will try to produce way too much fruit, and the fruit really won't size up, and the quality is affected as well. So we'll do a winter pruning. We're going to do a corrective pruning here to remove the center, and then any crossing branches that I see in there, we'll cut those out, and then we're going to top this tree at about 6 feet or so. Again, a lot of the fruit that would develop at the top, we're not going to be able to reach it. We want to keep it more or less at the ground level. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to have to use my pruning saw for this one because some of this wood's kind of big. We'll cut on both sides so we don't peel the bark. And we'll pull this out. Out of the camera. So as you can see, that was a major cut. Again, that's known as corrective pruning, where we need to take out, do major work and cut out, a lot of wood, or at least a larger diameter wood. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to prune all of these branches that we want to keep. I'm going to top them off at about 6 foot tall. Use a pole pruner. To do that, takes a while with just the pole pruner. It's a little bit larger diameter, too large for my pole saw, but I can reach it from the ground. Cut that one off. Cut these remaining shoots that are going straight up. And that's going to complete our winter pruning of a plum tree. So again, it's still going to leave plenty of blooms to have fruit, wood on there. Now all the fruit's going to be concentrated here lower so we can actually harvest it down here. And then what we'll do in the summer months, this will flush out again. We'll retop it, and any of this wood that that's growing up, that's beginning to fill in the middle, what we'll do is we'll come in and we'll make selective cuts to kind of remove that. But we want a nice canopy because plums, peaches, nectarines, those types of fruits, with all of this wood that's exposed to sunlight, it can actually sunburn and cause issues and actually kill the wood. So we want to make sure that there's enough shade in there where that doesn't occur, but we want a nice open area because the more sunlight that can hit more branches, the more flowers that you're going to have and more fruit that you're going to have, and that's kind of across. We'll demonstrate that on another crop here coming up. But anyway, that's going to be plums, and we'll look at some peaches here shortly. All right, moving on to persimmon trees. Persimmon trees, we typically grow them with a central leader trunk about 5 foot up before the tree begins to branch, as you can see there. And then, of course, they have more or less an open canopy at the top. So what we're going to do in this case, with persimmons, you want to prune out any dead or damaged wood and things like that to encourage new growth. You want to prune any suckering or anything that might be coming up from the base. Actually might be coming up from a rootstock as well. You know, any wood that's or branches that are starting to form on your main trunk below the canopy. This tree actually has pretty good shape to it. Has a relatively open center. We can see, and it might be hard to tell, some of the last cuts that were made were right here, here, and over in here. I don't know, I see 3 or 4 right across here. And this was all the growth that happened after last year. So what we're going to do is we're just going to bring these in a little bit. We just want to do a very light pruning. Trees that you don't need to do any corrective pruning on, nothing's in bad shape. You want to prune it just to encourage new growth, encourage new fruiting wood, but you're not going to do a severe cut on it. So we're going to go ahead and demonstrate that. Use my pole saw again. And I'm just going to come in and just remove some of these. Just to kind of bring it in. Similar to a landscape tree in a way. Again, we want to keep the fruiting wood relatively low so we can get to it. So here it is, early to mid-February. Just before the bud break, we'll prune these trees, fertilize them, try to force some new growth for early spring, and hopefully we don't get a late freeze that could damage the buds. You have a little bit different perspective than I do, but standing out from the tree, at least for me, standing back to look at the tree, see what else that we need to cut, moving around to get a different perspective on these things. You always want to make sure, and this goes for any of your plants that we're pruning, get out the wood that you've cut, because you don't want it to hang up in there, makes a mess, and it could harbor disease. Things like that, so we definitely want to pull it out of the canopy. A few more cuts, and that's about it. That looks pretty good. So see that? Again, we didn't have a lot of crossing branches or anything. Most of the branches are proportional to the other branches. It's pretty evenly spaced. The branches are evenly spaced out. So I just did a light pruning off the top. And that's going to be our persimmon. All right, figs. Easy large shrub, small tree to prune and maintain. These are actually in pretty good shape. It's kind of hard to see. But basically on figs, what you want to do, the wood that you want to prune out, especially on mature fig trees, is anything that's really close to the ground or really low, which can make a mess and harder to maintain underneath. These older fig trees, basically, we're going to kind of do the same as the persimmon. We don't have a lot of excess growth. Our branches seem to be growing outward like we want. And if we'll look at some of the fruiting wood here, if you guys can see this. So this is the last point at which this fig tree was pruned at. And this is the fruiting wood actually that we're going to have this year on these two. So even some lower branches down here you can see. Then at the terminal buds are going to produce buds as well. This tree is only about 6 feet tall. If I can back up and I'll stand next to it for reference. This tree's this big anyway, is about the correct size that we want. What I might do is prune, again, like I said, some of the lower branches down here. I'll go ahead and do that. Down at the base. So this had been pruned. It had been cut short, but not cut all the way off. That's another thing about pruning. If you're going to remove a branch or cut a branch, it's best to remove it back at its source and not just lop it off. Because then you end up with weird growth, and then you're going to have to end up cutting it again relatively soon. So it's best to just cut it off completely if you can. So I'll cut that one off and that one off, and really anything that might be touching the ground that you don't want, to kind of limit up a little bit, to keep your fruiting wood off the ground. Move those out of the way. You might remove this as well, but overall this is in pretty good shape. As a general rule of thumb, much like the other trees that we've discussed, you might come in if you do a hard pruning on this fig, you would only cut off maybe a third of the overall height of the plant. But this plant would have to be much larger for me to prune it. And if I did, I would prune it back to the same height. This is, for me, this is the ideal size of a fig tree, and has actually been properly pruned. So again, besides removing some of the lower branches, down there, we're gonna leave this one alone. All right, so on to the next crop. All right, I was gonna skip this one, I forgot about it. Mulberry trees. All right, so these trees were actually, I just wanted to show you this because these trees were actually, after harvest last year, were not pruned. So you can see the base of the mulberry tree, and it comes up with the mature wood. And then the last pruning cuts, I don't know if you can see this very well, where we have a lot of branching coming out. That's hard to see, but right here, maybe over here is a little easier to see. This was the last cut. And since that last cut, which would have been, I don't know, what, March of last year, they've grown quite a bit. So now this tree's probably, the upper branches are probably about 20 feet tall. Now that fruit up there, we're not going to be able to get from the ground very easily. So again, much like a lot of our other fruit trees, we're going to do a winter pruning on these. And it would, to actually finish this tree would take too long for this video. But essentially what I'm going to do is, again, flat top this tree. So if you can imagine, I'm looking at so we have the crown down there, and when the branches, let's see, I'm going to top this tree off about this high, to thicken up the branches underneath it, force a lot of the growth outward, laterally, horizontally to the ground, so we can harvest the mulberries from the ground, or at least, with a small ladder instead of all the way up at the top, because that fruit's not going to do us any good. So we want to force the growth down. Also want to keep the center of these trees open, so we might come in and take a couple of these branches that are growing straight up out to encourage you know, these branches on the outside, more of a, to maintain this tree more or less in a vase shape. Which will encourage more sunlight to enter the center of the canopy. Again, like on a lot of crops, the more sunlight you get inside the canopy, the more flowers, the more leaves, and the more fruit you should expect. Fruit is not going to develop and flowers will not develop in the shade. So these big guys here, again, should have been pruned. Let's see if I can get a area where there's not trees behind me. I don't really have anything for perspective here, but these are massive mulberry trees that we need to top. And again, we'll just cut them horizontally and about right here, or roughly on these trees, maybe about 7 or 8 feet off the ground, maybe. Again, if it's just plants in your yard, it's really not going to matter so much. You know, you just want to maintain the tree large enough for your space, and in such a form where you can get the fruit and as well as pruning it to maximize your fruiting ability. So we'll move on to the next crop. All right, now we're looking at blueberries. Blueberries are a little bit different. They're a shrub, obviously. They're not really a tree. And we don't do any winter pruning on blueberries because we don't want to cut off any of the fruiting wood, which is what we have right now. Blueberries in bloom or starting to bloom. So what we'll do is we will, right after harvest, so sometime in late May, what we will do is come in and we'll do a pruning, a topping, so to speak, where we will come in and adjust this. And basically what we'll do is we'll cut with a pair of shears, we're going to cut the top straight across, and then we're going to come in and we're going to cut the sides on both sides. So essentially, because these are in a row, we cut blueberries more or less like a square. And again, we're not going to cut off more than, let's say, about 1/3 of the actual top growth and the side growth. And doing so rejuvenates the wood for fruiting wood for next year. So we'll fertilize them throughout the summer and they'll regrow this particular wood. These plants are only a couple of years old, but if they were a little bit older, they would have some larger wood down at the base of the trees, or the bushes here. This wood is about, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of an inch right now. But as this wood gets older and progresses, maybe to an 1.5 inches, 2 inches in diameter, we would come in with our loppers and we would take out any of the larger wood down below to rejuvenate new growth coming up from the base. Because blueberries, they'll sucker up from the base, from the roots, and grow into a new plant. So that's blueberries on a short care on what we do with those. If you grow rabbit eye blueberries, these are southern high bush, by the way, which are a little bit smaller plants. But if you do grow rabbit eye blueberries, you're more or less going to treat them the same way. They're a little bit taller of a plant, but you're going to do the same thing. You'll hedge the tops and the sides of the plants, of these plants, and then as the bushes get older, you're going to go in and make selective cuts down at the base on some older material to take out to rejuvenate, to rejuvenate the plant, to have a nice crop of berries on that younger wood. All right, moving on, we have blackberries, and we're going to discuss two different styles, or two different types of blackberries or growth habits. This is a vining style blackberry, meaning that it grows from the base, but it cannot support itself. So what we do is we have to tie it to this trellis system here. We have to train it up. We actually use a V-trellis system, so half the plant up one side of the trellis and the other half of the plant up the other side of the trellis, to encourage sunlight, or to end up with more sunlight around the plant, more surface area. More surface area, again, meaning more blooms for the plants. Blackberries are a little interesting, and it's on both vining and shrub type blackberries, is that all of this wood that you see here, again, it's middle of February, all of this wood that you see here is kind of purplish in color. This is all of our this is what's known as floricane wood. So if I get a little closer, you might be able to see some of the buds on this. Now all of these buds will put out flowers, as well as there's some leaf buds in there, and that's our fruiting wood known as floricane. Then after the season, what happens is all of this wood dies. So all of the wood in this entire field actually dies. The plant itself doesn't die though. However, the roots themselves are perennials. So what happens once this plant, or once the top of the plant dies, we come in and we take hand clippers or even loppers and we cut out the base of this plant. And what happens is the new wood flushes from those roots, and it's really bright green, vigorous growth. And all of that growth will be our fruiting wood for next year. So all of that vigorous green growth that comes up is known as primocane wood. Primocane meaning the first wood. As it grows all summer, we tie it up. We do a little bit of pruning just to keep the vines from getting too tall. We like to keep the plants relatively small to balance fruit versus leafing on these plants. So anyway, we prune out all of the floricane wood after the season, and then it reflushes and we tie it up again. We do it all over again. The other style of blackberry is more of a bush type blackberry. So there's another field of it here. And it's the same exact thing, other than we don't trellis these varieties. So this grows more of a bush type. And again, all of the wood that you see here after the season dies. So we'll come in with hand clippers, cut it low, so there's virtually nothing in this field left. And then all of the floricane, or excuse me, the primocane wood grows up, and then again, that's our plant again. We do, for fruiting wood for the next year. We do some light pruning on these, just with shears, just to keep them a nice shrub-like shape, and where we don't have runners that are going to be typically too long like we have here. So these are what's known as they're semi-erect or erect blackberries, and these are trailing or vine type blackberries here. All right, these are peaches, which are going to be very similar to the plums that we discussed earlier. They're in the same family. If I can get a couple of good shots here. These trees are about 3 years old now. Anyway, so how we prune peaches, and similar of how I prune the plum tree, more in a vase shape. So again, we have maybe 18 inches to 24 inches of a single trunk out of the ground, and then that's where we prune it, and then we develop scaffold limbs, which are these limbs that you see here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and these scaffold limbs are the main limbs that are going to support the secondary limbs and eventually the fruit load. So essentially how we prune a peach tree is it's kind of like a bowl that sits on a stick, right? So the stick being the trunk, and then the bowl sits on top of that. So we try to prune a peach tree to have a hollow center. So if I can kind of zoom in close here. So this point here would be coming straight up, and you notice all of these branches are curved outwards. So peach trees, we want to encourage those branches more horizontally, more so than vertical. And so we essentially, and you can kind of see some cut marks again with a handsaw or with clippers, where we've pruned out some of the larger branches. So again, if you can envision this as being a bowl, and again, we prune a peach tree like this for much like some of the other plants, for sunlight. So the more sunlight that can penetrate the canopy, the more blooms and hopefully fruit we get. So we've just completed a winter pruning on these guys, and these have been flat topped. We can get this right, out to about 6 feet tall. So if you go down the line here, and you can see it. So we essentially just cut the top of the tree off completely flat, right? And then we come in and we do any handwork that we need to do in the middle, removing any larger branches that cross, or otherwise anything that's going to try to grow straight up in the center. There might be a few small branches that we leave, and that's fine for now. So these are younger trees. Over here we have some older trees that are probably 6 years old, and you can kind of see some of the same things. So this tree actually has 4 scaffolds coming out of the base, and we've trained these branches more horizontally and up, and then we flat top the tree at about 6 feet. And you can see these are starting to bloom now, so this is going to be our crop for this year. Right, so that's essentially how we prune peach trees, plum trees, as well as nectarine trees. So you can see it's quite a big field. This is a later variety. It doesn't bloom quite as early. And these over here on this side are a much earlier peach variety. All right, bananas. Bananas are the largest shrub in the world, right? So pruning bananas is actually really easy to do. As you can see, these have been smoked from a couple of freezes. Although we did have some, it did actually develop some bananas this past fall. But bananas grow a little bit differently. So bananas actually, how we prune them is we actually just cut them off at the base. Bananas actually have underground modified stems known as rhizomes, and that actually send up new pups after you cut it back. So this banana tree, which started out as 1, is now about 10 or so bananas. Right now, obviously the freeze burned off a lot of the foliage on them, but the stems are actually still alive, but the leaves are burned off. But each stem, once it flowers and produces bananas, it will never produce bananas again. So we need to encourage new growth or new pups to come out or to grow from the base. If I can do this without dropping my camera in the water, what we'll do is get a different angle. All right, we'll go with that. It's a little crooked for some reason, but anyway. What we'll do is we actually cut it off at the base, but we don't cut straight across it. Oh, by the way, yeah, we're using something a little bit different. We're using a machete on this because we're just going to cut it off. So we want to cut this stalk off, and we actually cut it at an angle. So we'll see how good we can get this. So that's pretty much it. And you can cut it lower than this, just for demonstration purposes. I cut it. I actually cut these. It's hard to see the angle, but we actually cut these at an angle so the actual stump that we leave doesn't collect water. If we cut it flat, water would collect and it could rot, and eventually could rot to the root system and actually kill the banana. So we actually cut it at an angle so water, again, that's kind of a bad angle, so I'll cut another one. Cut this one at an angle off of it, kind of the same thing, but it's going to, again, allow the water to wick off. And then once these are cut short, the plant will actually put all of its energy, instead of trying to supply the top, as almost said, it's going to put its energy into the roots, into the rhizomes, and hopefully send up new pups. And there's one actually right here that's starting to come up from the root systems. It got a little burn by the cold weather, but that's okay. And anyway, yeah, bananas, easiest things, at least in the stuff that we're talking about today, easiest things to prune. All right, and finally we have citrus. So pruning citrus is something that we are going to do in the very early spring, before bud break, or late winter in our case in north central Florida. If you notice, these trees are kind of self-pruned, more or less underneath, up to about 4 feet tall. This is because these trees are in a non-deer protected area and we have a lot of deer. Any other crops that you've seen in these videos have all been behind game fence where deer cannot get to them. But these citrus trees, or this small grove here, is not. But anyway, so we prune citrus in the late winter. Again, if we would harvest all of this citrus off of it, or you can prune off all the fruit as well. Now, because citrus wants to be a shrub type tree, we actually just do a heading back or topping back of the citrus. So I'm going to see if I can sneak in the video here for a second. And if you only have 1 or 2 trees, it's going to be more or less practical to use something like this to do any heading back. So what we're going to do is you're just going to bring the branches back to a common point. So kind of round the tree off. So we're going to cut off some of these branches. And again, these have fruit on them. These might not actually be strong enough, kind of. Probably need to use a stronger pole pruner for this particular job. Honestly, we actually don't even prune these citrus trees, but it would encourage new growth and more blooms on these trees. But anyway, you would do a heading back or topping. Where you're just going to trim the branches back to a common central point within the tree, across the top and around the sides. You might cut off some of these branches, and really this is just to encourage new growth, right? So kind of all the way around and around the top. Deer have, if you wanted, if you didn't want to fall to the ground citrus tree, you could just let the deer have at it. Except for when the citrus are very young, if they can eat over the top and eat out the central leader, that's going to be bad news. That's definitely not going to work. But anyway, yeah. So with just a handful of trees, again, just a topping. Very, very simple to do, just to encourage new growth. And you should be good to go on citrus.